Welcome all to the Meet the Coach webinar with the topic today of modern portfolio management with Gaetano Mazzanti, an agile coach from Italy. My name is Pascal Papatemelis and I'm located in Finland. We are both agile coaches at Agile 42. This webinar series is offered to you by Agile 42, where every coach in turns is introducing one interesting topic and himself to the audience. And today, Gaetano will talk about Kanban, flow, and things like that. So the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I still see Christina as a hand raised, so maybe
I will chat with her.
Yeah, okay. So let me start sharing my screen. My presentation. Here we go. Okay, so let's start. So today we talk about modern portfolio management. It's a very broad topic, so we'll look into some of the key aspects. Obviously, we cannot go into too much detail. Hope to arouse enough curiosity now. I'm Gaetano Mazzanti from Italy. I'm a coach and trainer. I'm with Agile 42 since 10 years, but let's not spend too much time about myself. Let me spend initially time to credit some of the guys that have helped to make this talk interesting. You will see their name on the lower left of the slides where I reference their work. So, in a nutshell, portfolio management is about how an organization selects initiatives and projects and how successfully it can deliver them to achieve its strategic objectives. So there are a number of questions that we need to answer to make this happen. And obviously one of the key ones is, when should we start a project, or should we defer or drop it? And then there's the issue of coordinating people, teams working on those initiatives and dealing with the inevitable dependencies that will show up. And then there's the issue of monitoring progress. How are we doing? And what are the issues? Are we aware of them? What are we doing? And then there's the issue of uncertainty and variability that was even more the norm before the crisis. I mean, the COVID-19 crisis. Now it's even more so. And then there's the legacy mindset, the legacy perspective, and this kind of question: how long will this take? How much will this cost? These questions are usually misplaced. We will look into this later. So if we look at this traditional portfolio, first of all, we notice that it struggled to answer those questions. And one of the reasons is that it's based on a mechanistic way of an organization, of how it works and how it's structured. And it's based on a set of beliefs, hopes actually, looking for certainty in scope, estimation, plans, and so on. So traditional portfolio is usually top down. It's centralized. There is typically a PMO office. I'm assuming that a company is doing portfolio management. Some are not doing it at all, but that's another issue. So the focus is in governance, compliance, a lot of time spent in specifying, over-specifying, analyzing, etc. A big problem is that decisions are made too early based on business priorities, and the people making those decisions are very far away, are separated from the people that later will work and execute those initiatives and projects. By the way, these people is typically put in a resource pool where they are pulled from, assigned to a project, and then when the project is finished, they go back to the pool and move to different teams and so on. And then there's the obsession with full capacity, full utilization. So people is split in 30% on project A, 40 on project B, and so on. and they do what we call Tetris allocation, perhaps using very cumbersome electronic tools. Things usually don't work. And now what happens? There's a cultural issues here. People focus on results, and when results don't come, they just think that they should improve the actions that led to the result. So if you have those illusions, then certainty-based ones, you think that you need maybe more status meeting, or better planning and estimating, or maybe better tools, bring more people in, bring the heroes, force people to work weekends, and so on. The problem here is that you should challenge your beliefs, your assumptions, and look at these issues from a different perspective. And now one could say, oh, but then we have agile, and agile will save us, right? Actually, that's not the case. It's not that simple. Even what do we mean when we say agile? Often we just mean, oh, we have some agile teams doing Scrum, or maybe even Kanban, or maybe we are implementing a scaling framework. Unfortunately, neither of the two will help us too much with those issues. Now, a quick reminder, team agility has nothing to do with business agility. Business agility means the ability to rapidly respond to change without losing momentum, ability to cope with fluctuating demand, and so on. Having agile teams doesn't help too much with that. Now I'll show you a slide that probably many of you have already seen. My friend Klaus Leopold created it, and it shows that we usually focus on a very small part of the end-to-end process where agile teams work. But improving that area doesn't help too much in terms of how effective we are to go to the market. How long does it take for us? Okay, so let's try to see what modern portfolio is, but we start from what it is not. For sure, it's not just having a board with tickets representing projects on it, and maybe we even have WIP limits on that board. Well, that's not portfolio management, and it's not even using Jira or other some fancy electronic tools to do the same, the board, and maybe even hoping that magically they will help us prioritization, allocating capacity, and creating wonderful plans. That's not what is portfolio management. So modern portfolio is a lot of things. I tried to summarize the 3 key things, in my opinion. So one is accepting and dealing with uncertainty and variability. No hope to avoid that. Then there's the issue of coordinating initiatives and services across teams at different level of detail and granularity. And then obviously we need to deal with demand and capability, managing and shaping demand to make the best possible use of our capability. So we'll go back to uncertainty later. Let me start focusing on coordination and strategy alignment. So here I'm using a metaphor introduced by Klaus, again, Klaus Leopold, the flight levels metaphor. And it's exactly related to an airplane flying. So the closer you fly to the ground, the more details you see, but obviously your perspective is limited. So we call this level 1, the operational level, where teams operate to deliver our initiatives. And teams can be doing Scrum, Kanban, whatever. There are dependencies among these teams. You see the red curves. And now we need to go up a higher level and focus on flow, value streams. And we have many initiatives and many teams working on some initiatives and some projects. Those you see in the level 2 are initiative and projects. So we can have a team working on multiple projects, whatever. And then again, we go up because we want to be sure that we are aligned with our strategy. That's level 3. And for each strategic initiatives, we have a number of projects or initiatives at level 2, and each one will be worked on by multiple teams and so on. So it's very important to have this global view of what's going on. It's a very important concept here is that these has nothing to do with hierarchy and roles. There's not a level 3 chief or manager and level 2 manager and so on. Okay, this is just has nothing to do with hierarchy and structure. So visualization, here we see a visualization of what's going on, and let's see and what a portfolio board could look like. Here is a very simplified one. So here there are two very different regions. You see different colors. Light blue is what we call the upstream portfolio or discovery portfolio. The part from ideas through analysis and synthesization until we reach a moment when we say, okay, this we want to do. And so an initiative reached the options inventory stage. On the right, we have the delivery part, what we call downstream portfolio, where execution takes place and we build, validate, and finally our initiatives are accepted. And the time it takes to go through those two areas is respectively, we call upstream lead time and system lead time. And another key part of the portfolio board is making clear where is the commitment point. When we take the final no return decision, when we cross that line, things cannot stop, cannot be discarded or canceled. Again, this is a very simplified one. Let me show you a real one. This is a portfolio board from our customers. You see, it's a very big one. And many times we insist with customers that hoping to use just electronic tools and digital boards is not helping them too much, and you can see why we are saying this. So these are ideas on the left side part. In the middle, you see business impact, and then some kind of technical feasibility until a project, a candidate project, reach the option inventory stage. So maybe it's too early, but if someone has already some questions here, I could stop sharing. If I could only find my cursor, and I can't.
So far, there are not any questions on the Q&A.
Okay, so I can move on. Fine. So let's focus on demand and capability. These are obviously two of the biggest issues when we deal with portfolio management. And demand and capability have various attributes. Demand can be fluctuating in time, in size, etc., conflicting. Sometimes it's irrefutable, the things that we have to
Gaetano,
do.
sorry to interrupt
Yes.
you. Could you please share your screen again?
Oh, I'm not sharing it?
No.
Interesting. Sorry. Okay. Are you seeing it? Can you see it? I cannot hear you.
Yes, I can see it. Just
Okay.
needed to move my mouse.
Okay, thank you. So, but again, demand and capabilities are two of the main issues when dealing with portfolio management. And these are very characteristics. Demand can be fluctuating in time, in size, and it can be conflicting. Sometimes it is irrefutable, things that we cannot choose to not do, like regulatory things. Then capability that's typically always overloaded. And then we have specialized capabilities. Obviously, people cannot do anything. Everyone has its own special skills, and we have to deal with that. So we have limited and constrained capability that we have to match to a very complex and variable demand. And it is what portfolio is about. So now we are going to look at some of these characteristics of demand and capability. So let's start with overburden. So avoiding to overload people and teams. Now at the team level, that's reasonably easy. If you're using Kanban, you can use WIP limits and columns and swim lanes, whatever. If you're using Scrum, the sprint planning helps you to avoid overburdening the teams, but that's not enough. And you cannot simply replicate the same scheme at the portfolio level. So yes, you can add the WIP limits to columns. Here I've prepared a simplified board where all the left columns, the one belonging to the upstream part, have been collapsed to a single column on the left, where you see project A. Now, if you use WIP limits at the portfolio level, in a case like this, you see that the active column has a WIP limit of 3, and there are only 2 projects there. So one could think, oh, then I can pull a new project, project B, to column 3. But let's look on the right at which teams are working on our projects. And forget about the number of people in each team, just focus on those circles, those tokens that represent the team's capability of working on parallel initiatives. Now, the red team has 4 of those tokens, and you can see that they are being used on projects C, D, and D. So what would happen in a standard approach, simply WIP-based, is this. Project B will be pulled because we are not violating the WIP limit on that, but this will result in a big problem because the green and the blue teams are ready to work on it, but we should wait for team red. And the rationale is, oh, but the reds will come. Actually, they won't, or they will, but it will be late and we'll be into big troubles with this project, slowing down it and maybe other projects. So we should not start B, even if that will not break the WIP limits. So what can we do? And what can we do is, for instance, to use what we call CAP tokens. This is a Patrick Stewart, and many of these concepts come from him. CAP means capability tokens. So we can use that gray area close to the options inventory column that show very clearly which are the available tokens. And now we have 1 blue, 1 green, and 2 purple. And there's no available red token. So we simply cannot start project B. Okay. So this is an example from the real world. Again, one of our customers. Each team has 2 tokens. The color represents the skill. It could be mechanical, electronics, firmware in this case. They were using these tokens in a way that was slightly different from what I showed, but the basic concept was there anyway. So sometimes it happens that we have very important projects that we want to be sure that we will have the capability to start them when the time comes. So in this case, we can use a reservation mechanism and assign those tokens earlier in the while the project is still in the upstream phase. Like in this case, we have assigned a red token and a purple token to project A. That's very important, so that we are sure that when it will reach the options inventory column, we will be ready to pull it because the teams will be available to work on it. Okay, so another concept that's very important is selection policies. Actually, we already seen a number of policies. Policies are the rules, the rituals that we use to make a system work, so make a portfolio system work. And these policies should be transparent and known to every people involved in the system. In this case, we have 3 requests 3 projects that could be started coming from different customers, so A, B, and C. But we see that we only have 2 green tokens available, and all the 3 projects require a token from the green team. So we can only start 2 of them. Now the question is, which one? And for these, we need policies. And we could use an authority ranking kind of approach, the boss decide, or we could use a consensus, consent-based mechanism, or a round-robin kind of scheme, or a more marketplace-like thing based on prices, contracts, and whatever. The important thing is that these policies are known and shared and transparent. Okay, a couple of things, and then we do a short break. Here, the concept of min and max limits. This is especially useful in addressing fluctuating demand. And demand can be exceeding capability. Sometimes demand can be low, not enough. And so we want to avoid starving, for instance. So while the concept of max limits, I think, is very easy to understand to everyone, you see in this board, in the upstream part, that there are also min limits. Analyzed, for instance, as a minimum of 10 items and a maximum of 20. We use minimum limits to avoid starvation. And this is especially true in the options inventory column. You see the minimum is 2. And whenever we reach that lower limit, that's a signal, it's an order point to make sure that new projects, new options arrive from the upstream process. And one final thing before a short break, the idea of customer Kanban. So usually we are able to put in place a pull mechanism in the gray area, but that's not always enough to guarantee that there's a real pull mechanism all through the end-to-end process. When customer requests work, that's often urgent. But then when it's time for them to accept and validate, things get usually slow. Maybe they have not enough resources, different priorities, whatever. But that doesn't prevent them to keep asking for additional work. So a way to deal with this using what's called customer Kanban, we give customers tokens. These are customer tokens, not related to the previous tokens we saw. So each customer has a limited number of them, and they get back tokens when something is really accepted and validated. So the token goes back, and then they can use it to pull new ideas that can go then into the system. And you see we have on the lower part of the slide what we call customer lead time. That's the total time required to go through the whole system, and that's very important for our competitiveness and from our time to market performances. So I think we can now take a break.
Yes, and we have some questions already.
Yeah, my problem is that I have some troubles in stop sharing. I don't know why, but my...
Yes, but I can ask the questions.
Okay.
So you can answer them at the same time. Alok is asking, what is a good strategy for new startups, traditional versus modern?
Portfolio? Startups, let's look at the assumption. I'm assuming that a startup doesn't have a lot of parallel projects going on. Probably they are focused maybe on just 1 or 2, I don't know. But if you're a startup, I'm not seeing any reason to use a legacy traditional approach in general, even the less for a portfolio. But for sure, you have to structure your initiatives in a way that you get early feedback if what you're doing is, how do you say, customer are liking it, are interested in it or not. And that's all part probably of the upstream portfolio. And so you have to put policies there in place to deal with this. But for sure, I don't think you're doing GANs and that kind of estimation for new projects that you are probably prototyping, making experiments with. I don't know if I answered the question.
Okay, hopefully. If not, then please specify it more clearly. Yes, it is answered. Thank you.
Okay.
So then we have a question from Johan. Would the policies be shared to the customer A, B, and C as well? And that came a bit earlier as a comment.
Good question. And now I'm reverting to the typical coaching answer, that is, it depends. Ideally, yes, it would be nice. By the way, customers could also be internal customers, so not necessarily external ones. So especially if they are internal, the answer is definitely yes. If they are external, it depends on the kind of the level of trust that we have with your customers, the kind of relation, and maybe also the criticality of keeping important information not so transparent, for instance, to other customers, because that would mean that every customer can see what other customers are requesting. Sometimes, again, if there's a high level of trust between you and your customers, yes. Otherwise, be careful. But with internal customers, I would say definitely yes.
And then there is a question from Minsu. How do you decide how many CAP tokens each team has?
That's a very good question. And I would say it's, in a way, it's similar to how do you decide which WIP limits to use. Unfortunately, there's no magical recipe for this. And the only thing you can do is to try to experiment, start with some common sense initial values, and then try to do some experiment and test, trying to measure what's really happening and having objective ways to evaluate what's happened and then move from that. Obviously, in my example, I used many tokens, but we don't like teams to work in parallel on too many projects. So ideally, that should be very few tokens.
Okay, thank you. We have another question which is a bit longer, but I think perhaps we should hurry because we have 15 minutes still when we should, like, be ready with the presentation.
Okay, so maybe we can save it for later?
Yes, that was my suggestion.
Okay, fine. So let's move on. So up to now, we have talked about policies to select comparable options. Sometimes this is not possible. You cannot compare apples and oranges, or maybe sometimes in a crisis like now, or in an ER department in an hospital. And so in this case, we try to use what's called a triage approach. Triage was invented in a Napoleonic army for bleeding soldiers wounded in the battle. They came to the field hospital, and doctors and nurses had to quickly evaluate if they could survive but needed to be treated immediately, or they could survive and they could wait for being treated later, or there was no hope. We could use a similar approach in business when we have to quickly decide if something has to be done immediately, or if some project could wait for later, and then the issue is when, or if we should drop it. If you think to what happens in the ER department, you are assigned a color, and each color basically is a routing mechanism. So it's very important to understand that triage is not just prioritization, it's routing. So writing to different paths, to different places where different actions and people take care of the patient in the case of hospital. And now in our cases, we have different ways and maybe people to deal with projects that we assign to different routing. For this, in business, we use classes of services. So basically, we assign a color, like in a ER, to each of our initiatives. And a class of service is basically a set of policies, actions, and rituals that we associate to each of our initiatives. And to do this, we often use cost of delay. Cost of delay, you can think to it as the equivalent of bleeding in the battlefield. So there are things that have a huge cost of delay, and the impact would be huge if we don't do them immediately, all the emergencies typically. And then there are things that have a fixed date, and it's okay to not complete them too early, but then we have to be sure that they are completed by the expected date. And then there are the standard things that are more or less linear. The longer we wait, the more we'll pay for this. And then what we call intangible, that's those things that never get enough, up enough in our list. And so things like tech debt, or a nice feature that you would like to have, but there are always more important features that stay there until all of a sudden, oops, the impact is huge because maybe a competitor introduced that feature and now we need to rush up to catch up. So there are many different types of cost of delay curves and of classes of services. Here I only showed the 4 more typical ones. So now a question is, how do we choose which class of service to assign to our initiative or project? So we can look at cost of delay from the perspective of comparing it to the time it's required to complete a certain project or initiative. So here you see we have curve with the orange area behind it. That's what we call the shelf life or life cycle period curve. That is, how long will our service product survive in the market? It could be a very short time. Think if you're an e-commerce site to Black Friday, you only have a few days to deliver that service. And maybe it could take a lot of time to develop all the features that you want to be able to achieve. Or maybe sometimes the product will remain in the shelf in the market for long, months, maybe even years. So what we want to look at is the ratio between the life cycle period and the time, you see the lead time distribution here, required to complete a project. And the ratio could range from ultra short, upper situation, and go down to short, medium, long, and extra long if the time the product can stay in the market is much, much longer than the time it takes to develop that project. Now, the curve on the right, the one with the orange area below it, actually could have different shapes. And here we see some of them, what we call value acquisition function or payoff functions. It could be a curve that, for instance, in the front-loaded case, where the impact is high, immediately high in the beginning, and then it goes down with a shallower inclination, or it could be the reverse, a backloaded curve, or it could be a constant rate. The impact is always the same, no matter what's the time. Or the impulse case is the Black Friday. We only can do that on a particular day, otherwise we are doomed. So combining these information, the shape of the curve and the ratio that we have seen earlier, we can use these triage tables. And these are very new. I'm sure no one has yet seen these before. This comes from the work of David Henderson in the Kanban community. So here we have a table where we can immediately decide which class of service to assign to our projects. So you see you have a short ratio between the payoff function and the time required. And if you have a bell curve, then you should assign the standard class of service, and so on. This is a very practical and fast and effective way to assign classes of services to our initiatives. So please let me state this again. Understanding which class of service to assign to each initiative or project is a key part of making the portfolio management works fine. And we can use this information, this curve distribution also, to try to understand when we should start something. So once we know the lead time distribution on one side and the life cycle period on the right side, suppose we have a desired delivery date. Here you see the green vertical line. And then we can decide when to start. In the early case, the blue one, you see a very early start, and we finish the project much earlier than the desired late. That's not a great idea. It's not so smart. We are wasting the opportunity to work on other more important stuff. A normal start would make us complete the project at the exact date, the exact delivery date. But maybe we can start a bit later. For instance, LRM stands for last responsible moment. In that case, you can see that we finish later than the desired date. But at that point, the cost of delay, the height of the right curve is not so much. So the impact of being late is still low, and we could decide to take that risk. Again, this is based on policies and sharing of decision making. Okay, so very helpful information here. That's the typical question. When should we start? These can really help you make better decision. So when we talk about time, we usually talk about estimations. And estimation is an obsession of the legacy approach. The funny thing is that typical, especially in the end-to-end flow, most of the time is spent not working on the projects, but waiting for blocks, for slowdowns that often are induced by dependencies. So if you have to spend time estimating something, you're probably better estimating the wait time more than the effort and the size of a project. Again, we treat dependencies management and estimation in a similar way. I mean, that sometimes you shouldn't bother either estimating or making dependency discovery. And again, cost of delay helps us in this, because if something has a low cost of delay associated to it, then there's no point in spending time estimating effort or estimating dependencies. Otherwise, if that's not the case, again, we need to understand which class of service to assign to a project or initiative. Now, a quick definition of calling and called service. Whenever we have a calling service that needs work, or a service from another service that we call the called service in the case. So we have a calling service that requests something from a called service that will deliver that service, and that's a dependency. Even also here we have a table that helps us based on the cost of delay, and then we need to understand which action to put in place and which class of service that match the definition of the classes of service that we've seen before. So for a very low cost of delay, who cares about dependencies? And then when we go down to where the cost of delay impact could be significant, or we have no margin for error, then we have to use different classes of services like orange, fixed date, or red, immediate action, for instance, guaranteeing reservation with reservation mechanisms both on the calling and on the called services. So very quickly, we're reaching the end. Uncertainty and variability. So I think we don't have too much time, but it's clear that whenever relevant information is unavailable or unknown, we have uncertainty, and this means unpredictability. If we add to that variability, especially in demand, that makes things even less predictable. So how should we deal with this? Now, let me try to use this classification, slightly adapted from a concept that Liz Skills introduced. So whenever we have to do something, it's typically already been done by our teams, or maybe never done by our teams, but done by someone else, some other departments maybe in our company, or it could have been never done by our company, but maybe by some competitors, or it could maybe something that has never been done by anyone. So we can map this to the Kinefin domain. I'm sure most of you know what's the Kinefin domain. I will not go into any detail about this, only showing that we can map those 4 classifications in this domain, and we can use these to understand, to infer if estimating makes sense or not. Obviously, for things that we have already done or have been done by our teams, or at least in our company, it makes perfect sense to estimate, or maybe we can even outsource or buy it. Or in the case we are more on the left, estimating things that we have never done is completely useless and stupid, if I can add. Okay, we can use these 4 categories also to try how to risk hedge our portfolio. This is not a board, this is just a table. And you see the columns corresponding to those 4 categorizations. And then on the left, the rows represent if a project is strategic, operational, or a bit of both. So we can distribute all our initiatives in this table, so to balance them and make sure that we either don't play it too safe or we don't take too many risks. So we could use some kind of approach like WIP limits or percentages to decide how many projects we like in each of those areas, or use something like this, for example. And in this way, we can be sure that we have a well-balanced in terms of risk hedging portfolio. Obviously, all these things can be used together. We can use boards at various levels, these kind of tables, and put all of them together in what we call modern portfolio. So we are closing now. We've seen the 3 key parts of the portfolio. And so there is much more. And usually we do workshop on these subjects, both with our customers and public. So just to close, I think you have seen a lot of differences between traditional and modern portfolio management. The main point is make sure that the decision we make, when we make them, how we make, allows us to adapt quickly and to start what's most meaningful and when it's most convenient to start it, and when we are reasonably confident that we can finish it. Easy to say, but with the right approach and with the right policies, we can get very close to that. So just a final reminder, starting work costs money. It's finishing work that makes you money. And every time something is blocked or delayed, that costs money. So we want to definitely avoid that. And that applies also to debating too much and too early, in the initial phase of the project. So the things you should focus on is making workflow at any level. That is what makes you money. And I think we are done. And by the way, as I was saying, we do some workshop. There's one scheduled in Italy. Sorry, it's in Italian in June, but we plan to do one in English in July. And then there are our organic agility portfolio system design packages for even more advanced stuff and close to our organic agility approach. And I think we are done.
Thank you, Gaetano. And we have already a few questions from Christian. He's asking, can you give an example what kind of teams these are? They seem to be highly specialized, like testing team, dev team, documentation team, etc. Would it not be more modern to strive for one cross-functional team per project or not multiple teams? I think this came like before the second break when you were showing the tokens for the different teams in the Kanban board.
I got the question, but I missed the initial part. Could you repeat just the first sentence?
It was about what kind of teams those are. He got the feeling that their teams were very specialized, like development team, testing team, etc. And in an agile world, we have cross-functional teams.
No, not necessarily. Obviously, some kind of cross-functionality is better, but maybe there are teams that are cross-functional but more focused on mobile, and maybe others are more focused on desktop or web-based application. So yes, cross-functionality in general is nice and better. By the way, about the team, how teams are formed and how big they are, there are a lot of new ideas coming out. And well, I don't think this is the right context, but both the size and the type and level of cross-functionality is kind of being challenged now. Anyway.
Good, thank you. Hopefully this answered the question. There is another question from Julia. Could you explain again what a class of service is, or give an example? Is the same as the categories of cost of delay?
Yes, as I said, class of service is a set of policies that we assign to our projects. For instance, an emergency project takes priority, and maybe all people that can are moved in that and stop doing what they were doing because that's an emergency. That's a very obvious and simple case. But just to give you an idea of a class of service, think in a very different context to your tickets when you take a flight. And you could take a business flight or an economy flight, and those are different class of services. If you buy a business ticket, you get a prioritized queue for dropping your baggages. You can go to the lounge. You board first. You have larger seats. That's a different set of policies that we apply to someone that buys a business ticket versus the ones that buy an economy one. I hope this helps. So we treat things differently, and we have to define how each class of service will be treated.
Okay, I think we have no other questions at the moment. So I could perhaps also inform that we have a training coming up related to flight levels. We can find that in our website. I will post that in the chat. And also we have a related blog about flight levels.
Okay.
And yes, thank you very much.
Hope you have enjoyed.
There are no more questions.
I think, well, we will make these slides available. So then if you have any kind of question, you can write us.
Yes.
You have our email addresses also in the slides.
Good. Yes, and we will share also the recording together with the material. This will take probably, it will be like beginning mid next week.
Okay.
We will email that to you. Thank you very much, and I wish you all have a nice day and stay healthy and home and strong.
Bye.